Sarah Whitmore smiled through tears as she handed out missing flyers for her husband, Daniel, but behind that carefully crafted grief was the dark truth that she had already buried him. They were the kind of couple people spoke of fondly, using words like solid, devoted, and inseparable. Their story had all the marks of a modern suburban fairy tale. Daniel was a well-loved high school science teacher, known for his patience with struggling students and his calm, gentle nature. Sarah owned a small flower boutique on the edge of town. She told the police they had spent a quiet Sunday evening together watching a movie. She said Daniel had seemed a little distracted lately, but she chalked it up to end-of-semester stress. She mentioned he hadn't been sleeping well. Nothing else struck her as unusual. She insisted that something terrible must have happened to him. She remembered what Daniel wore, what movie they had watched, even what they had for dinner. But she stumbled when asked when she last saw him physically walk out the door. She wore Daniel's old sweaters. She hosted prayer circles. Daniel had been deeply unsettled. He didn't give specifics, but he had discovered something on Sarah's computer, something serious. The idea of Daniel simply walking off began to crumble. Police discreetly searched Sarah's laptop and found that some files had been deleted in recent days. They retrieved fragments of a document related to life insurance policies and a list of transactions under unfamiliar names. They began pulling her phone records, analyzing her financial history, and checking her movements. He said he planned to talk to her about it that weekend. That was the last conversation the coworker had with him. Daniel Whitmore didn't vanish. He didn't run away. Something had happened inside that neat little house with the porch swing and rose garden. And for the first time, investigators began to believe that Sarah knew exactly where Daniel was and what had happened to him. She baked casseroles for the volunteers helping search for him. But the more she tried to appear heartbroken, the more some people began to whisper. Not because she wasn't convincing, she was, but because she was too convincing. Every tear was perfectly timed, every gesture calculated. Police officers began to notice how she never asked about certain leads or demanded updates. She was cooperative, but detached when the topic turned toward investigative details. She didn't press them. She didn't ask about phone pings or license plate tracking. She focused instead on the emotion, the grief, the sympathy. She said she had gone back to bed and didn't actually see him leave. The officers filed the information but didn't press her too hard yet. It was still early in the investigation. Her arrangements were always a hit at weddings, church events, and fundraisers. Sarah coordinated search parties, knocking on neighbors' doors, hanging posters at grocery stores and gas stations. She contacted local news outlets and gave tearful interviews. The footage showed her pleading with viewers for information, holding Daniel's photo close to her chest, her eyes red and swollen. The entire town rallied around her. Friends brought over meals. Volunteers showed up at the house to offer help. Everyone felt sympathy for the young woman who had lost her husband so suddenly and mysteriously. Together they looked like the embodiment of suburban bliss. A neighbor named Jenna, who lived across the street, quietly told police that she hadn't seen Daniel at all that morning. She usually watched him leave for work around 7:30 a.m. sharp while sipping coffee by her window, but that day there was no sign of him. She thought maybe he had taken a sick day until the flyers appeared. In the picturesque town of Maple Ridge, where white fences lined every driveway and neighbors exchanged cookies during the holidays, Sarah and Daniel Whitmore were admired by almost everyone. Their house was small but beautifully kept. A red front door, a porch swing, and neat flower beds spoke volumes about how much care they put into their home. Search dogs picked up his scent leading from the back of the house to the end of the backyard fence. Then the trail went cold. There were no camera sightings, no purchases, no calls. It was like he had vanished from reality. Daniel didn't show up at school. At first, no one panicked. Even the best teachers occasionally took a sick day. But as the hours passed and he didn't call in, his coworkers grew uneasy. When the school secretary called his phone, it went straight to voicemail. That was unusual. Daniel was known for being reliable and structured. He never left people wondering. The principal called Sarah, and she sounded concerned, saying Daniel had left for work at his usual time that morning. On weekends, Daniel could be seen washing his car or reading on the porch while Sarah tended to her roses. Her voice on the 911 call trembled with worry as she explained that her husband had returned home, hadn't answered calls or messages, and hadn't checked in with anyone all day. Officers arrived quickly. There were no signs of forced entry, no broken windows, no signs of struggle. Daniel's car was still parked in the driveway. His wallet and keys were on the kitchen counter. His phone lay on the nightstand, untouched. Even his neatly packed lunch sat unopened on the table. To the officers, it looked like Daniel had simply vanished into thin air. Neighbors often waved at them, admiring their quiet life. They never argued in public. They attended every town event. Sarah brought muffins to school board meetings, and Daniel helped coach the science fair team even after hours. No one ever imagined there could be anything sinister behind their front door. The illusion began to crack on a seemingly ordinary Monday. By mid-afternoon, Sarah called the police. Sarah seemed frantic, pacing around the living room, clutching a framed photo of the two of them on their wedding day. Within 24 hours, missing person flyers with Daniel's face began appearing all over town. But even in those early days, something about the situation didn't sit right with a few people. The police began to scrutinize Sarah's story. They noted how detailed it was, almost too detailed. As days passed with no sign of Daniel and no activity on his bank accounts, the case grew more perplexing. Meanwhile, Sarah leaned heavily into her role as the grieving wife. Then came the news that complicated things further. One of Daniel's co-workers stepped forward and shared a conversation he had with Daniel just a week before he disappeared. Now, Sarah's story no longer seemed airtight. The more they looked, the more it seemed the perfect couple next door had cracks hidden under a polished surface. The investigation into Daniel Whitmore's disappearance quickly shifted from a missing person case to something far more unsettling. As the initial shock wore off, law enforcement doubled down. The charming town of Maple Ridge had never seen a case like this one, where a man vanished from his home in broad daylight without leaving a single trace, and where the one person closest to him, his wife, Sarah, might know more than she was saying. Search teams returned to the neighborhood, sweeping through every corner. Officers knocked on doors, revisited surveillance footage, and expanded the search perimeter. They looked through trash bins, storm drains, wooded areas, and vacant lots. Flyers continued to appear, featuring Daniel's smiling face and the words, "Missing husband, please help." Sarah continued to play her role as the heartbroken spouse with remarkable consistency. She wept at community gatherings, handed out candles for vigils, and reposted every flyer on social media with pleading captions. On the surface, she was doing everything a desperate wife should do, but behind the scenes, things weren't adding up. Daniel's car, still parked in the driveway, had not been touched. There were no fingerprints on the door handles besides his and Sarah's. His cell phone had never left the house. Even more disturbing, the last activity on the phone was a text message drafted to someone named Mark, never sent and saved in the Notes app. It read, "I need to tell you something. Found out today, can't believe it. If something happens." The rest was unsaved. The message was enough to unsettle investigators. They brought in Mark, Daniel's colleague and close friend, and asked about the cryptic message. Mark's face went pale. He told them Daniel had been acting strange the week before he vanished. Withdrawn, distracted, like something was weighing on him heavily. He said Daniel hinted at having found something disturbing, but didn't elaborate. Mark had assumed it was something school-related. Now, he feared it had been something more serious. That message, incomplete and never sent, felt like a warning. At the same time, detectives were diving into Sarah's online activities and personal history. Her browser history, even after attempted deletions, revealed several troubling searches. How to make someone disappear without a trace? Husband missing police procedure. And can you collect life insurance if no body is found? Were just a few of the recovered entries. There were also late-night visits to forums discussing home security blind spots and how to disable motion-activated lights. The evidence was circumstantial, but the pattern was becoming harder to ignore. Sarah had recently taken out a life insurance policy on Daniel, a large one. Investigators traced it back to an application she submitted just 2 months prior, listing herself as the sole beneficiary. At the time, there had been no indication Daniel knew about the policy. To neighbors, this was completely out of character. Daniel was practical, honest, and deeply cautious. He would never agree to something like that without thorough discussion. Detectives now had a theory. Daniel had stumbled upon Sarah's secret's financial lies, insurance policies, maybe more, and she had panicked. The idea was chilling, but it started to make sense. Sarah stood to gain from his death, both financially and socially. A grieving widow garners sympathy, and in a small town like Maple Ridge, sympathy could stretch a long way. The turning point came when forensic analysts examined the backyard more thoroughly. Initially, the garden had been overlooked. It was neat, blooming with freshly planted flowers and recently tilled soil. Nothing seemed unusual. But when aerial drone footage was cross-referenced with older images from real estate listings, investigators noticed something strange. The garden had been expanded by almost 2 feet in one direction during the exact week Daniel went missing. Ground-penetrating radar was brought in. It detected an anomaly beneath the soil, something rectangular and consistent with the shape of a tarp or wrapped object. Investigators paused. Without a body, Sarah couldn't be charged with murder. And digging up a backyard without a warrant or concrete cause would raise legal concerns. They had to wait. During that time, Sarah maintained her role in public. She wore Daniel's jacket, kept the porch light on, and even left messages on his voicemail. But neighbors noted something odd. She never seemed tired. She never broke down unexpectedly. Everything was carefully measured. And then came an even more disturbing clue. A neighbor's teenage son, who had set up a wildlife camera in his backyard facing the alley between their homes, reviewed his footage and brought it to the police. On it, at around 2:15 a.m., the night Daniel vanished, a figure matching Sarah's height and build was seen dragging a large object across the yard. The footage was grainy and far away, but the timestamp matched the time frame of Daniel's last known activity. The object appeared to be long and heavy, wrapped in something light-colored, possibly a bedsheet or tarp. With that footage and the anomaly in the soil, the police secured a warrant to dig. They chose a day when Sarah would be out hosting yet another community meeting about her missing husband. As the sun rose over the quiet street, officers gathered in the Whitmore backyard and began to excavate. They didn't find a body, at least not at first. What they uncovered was even more haunting. Beneath the soil, carefully wrapped in layers of plastic and canvas, were several personal items: a blood-stained hammer, Daniel's broken wristwatch, and a torn shirt with what appeared to be defensive knife marks. Nearby, partially burned, were scraps of paper later reconstructed to be pages from Daniel's journal. One page included the line, "I don't know who I married anymore." Sarah returned home to find police tape around her garden. Her face didn't register surprise, only the kind of quiet, tired resignation that investigators found telling. She claimed she had no idea what was happening. She was escorted to the station for questioning. But even in that moment, without a body, police couldn't arrest her. They needed more. They needed Daniel. The story took over local headlines. News vans parked on the street. Commentators speculated. Neighbors whispered. Some still believed Sarah was innocent, clinging to the idea that maybe Daniel had run away or suffered some kind of breakdown. Others were convinced Sarah had carefully orchestrated everything, murdered her husband, and then stood beside his photo, asking for help to find him. And through it all, Sarah kept up appearances. She lit candles at night, changed her profile picture to a photo of Daniel, and posted quotes about grief. But the mask was beginning to crack, and the town of Maple Ridge was starting to wonder what was real and what was performance. The search was no longer just for a missing man, it was for the truth that someone had tried desperately to bury. The town of Maple Ridge had changed. What was once a peaceful, tightly knit community filled with trust and tradition now felt uneasy, like a stage where everyone played a role in someone else's secret. As the investigation into Daniel Whitmore's disappearance deepened, so did the divide between those who believed in Sarah's innocence and those who couldn't shake the feeling that something dark lay beneath her carefully polished exterior. Sarah's public behavior remained flawless. She continued organizing prayer circles, distributing flyers, and doing interviews. Her house became a sort of vigil ground, with candles flickering on the porch every night and stacks of missing posters waiting by the door. Her voice on the local news was always composed, often cracking at the right emotional beats. She spoke about hope, about faith, about love that doesn't give up. To the untrained eye, she was a woman enduring unimaginable pain. But behind closed doors, the police were following the trail of inconsistencies left behind in Sarah's digital and financial life. Her boutique's financial records showed months of mounting debt. Credit cards maxed out, loans unpaid, suppliers walking away from unpaid invoices. To keep up the image of success, Sarah had dipped into their joint savings, then opened new accounts under Daniel's name without his knowledge. These discoveries painted a new picture, one of desperation and manipulation hidden beneath a facade of control. The timeline now made more sense. 2 months before Daniel disappeared, Sarah applied for a large life insurance policy on him. 1 month before, she transferred $4,200 to a man named James R. Hayes in another state, using a fake email alias and listing the payment under consulting. When investigators tracked down James, they found he had a record for helping people obtain false documents. Although he denied any recent involvement, his name appearing in Sarah's transactions was enough to warrant further scrutiny. Meanwhile, forensics continued examining items found beneath the garden. The hammer had traces of Daniel's blood, hair, and skin. His watch was broken at 2:16 a.m., matching the time shown in the neighbor's night camera footage. Forensic teams confirmed the shirt had blood patterns suggesting Daniel had raised his arms defensively, likely trying to shield himself from multiple blows. Each detail tore further into the image Sarah had tried to build. The narrative of a grieving wife was unraveling thread by thread. But the most damning clue came from an overlooked piece of evidence. Inside the Whitmore house, police had seized Sarah's laptop and 2 USB drives. A hidden folder buried under layers of renamed files contained audio recordings, journal entries. Daniel had recorded for himself in the months leading up to his disappearance. In them, his voice was calm but increasingly strained. He spoke about his suspicions, about discovering unfamiliar credit card statements and hidden browser tabs. He mentioned overhearing Sarah talking on the phone late at night, saying phrases like, "I'll handle it," and "he can to find out." One recording, dated just 2 days before he vanished, was especially chilling. In it, Daniel said, "If something happens to me, it wasn't an accident. I know things I'm not supposed to. I think Sarah is capable of something I didn't believe before. If I'm wrong, I'll delete this. But if I'm not, I hope someone hears this." With that recording, investigators had what they needed to start building a murder case. But without a body, formal charges remained elusive. The law required more an undeniable physical confirmation that Daniel was dead. His personal items, blood, and voice painted a near-complete picture, but the final piece still lay buried literally or metaphorically. That's when detectives started to reevaluate everything, searching for overlooked clues. They focused again on Sarah's behavior in the days immediately following Daniel's disappearance. Through interviews with neighbors and security footage analysis, they noticed that she had made 2 early morning trips in her car on the day after Daniel vanished, and again 3 days later. Both times she drove out of town for approximately 40 minutes, stayed in one remote location for just under half an hour, and returned without any explanation. Those trips had gone unnoticed at first, buried under the chaos of early investigations. But now, with a new lens, they became suspicious. The area she visited was rural and forested, close to a nature preserve and far from any businesses or attractions. Detectives conducted a quiet search and discovered disturbed earth near a shallow creek. Concealed by fallen branches and old tarps, the excavation revealed the truth. Wrapped in black plastic and buried beneath several inches of soil and brush was Daniel Whitmore's body. The decomposition was consistent with the timeline of his disappearance. An autopsy confirmed blunt force trauma to the back of the skull as the cause of death. He had also sustained a broken wrist and fractured ribs, likely during a struggle. Sarah was arrested the same evening. She was at home, preparing to attend another prayer vigil for Daniel. Her expression when officers arrived was blank, unreadable. She didn't resist, didn't cry, didn't speak. She was escorted out of the house she had once shared with the man she buried under a creek bed, in front of a dozen flashing cameras and stunned neighbors. The town was shaken. Some refused to believe it. Others said they always had a feeling. The flowers in Sarah's boutique wilted, the windows boarded up within weeks. Her social media accounts were deleted, her name wiped from local newsletters and community boards, but the real impact was more personal. People who once trusted easily began locking their doors. Neighbors no longer waved as freely. There was a quiet understanding that the image of a perfect marriage, of love without flaw, could be a lie. Daniel had trusted Sarah completely. He had built a life around her, supported her dreams, and stood by her during hardship. And in return, he had become a threat to be removed. His recordings were played at his memorial, haunting reminders of a man who knew the danger he was in, but hoped he was wrong. In one of them, he said, "I still want to believe she's the person I married, but the facts say otherwise." Now, those facts could no longer be ignored. The mystery of Daniel Whitmore's disappearance had been solved, but the price of the truth had been devastating. What remained was the shadow of a story that looked like love but ended in betrayal, a cautionary tale of how darkness can grow in the most beautiful of gardens. Sarah Whitmore's arrest sent shockwaves far beyond. Maple Ridge, the woman who had once symbolized grace under tragedy, now stood accused of calculated, cold-blooded murder. The news spread quickly across television, online forums, and local newspapers. Her image, once associated with flowers and candlelight vigils, was now replayed in slow motion, her blank face as she was led away in handcuffs. The porch of her house swarmed by reporters, the shattered trust of a community caught off guard by the depth of her deception. As detectives pieced together the full timeline, what emerged was a narrative that stunned even seasoned investigators. Sarah hadn't simply killed in a moment of rage or panic. This had been planned, staged, and disguised with disturbing precision. In the days leading up to Daniel's death, Sarah had scrubbed her internet history multiple times. But forensic software recovered search entries about bloodstain cleanup methods, decomposition timelines, and how to mimic signs of a break-in. Even the flyers and TV interviews were part of a larger, manipulated performance. She had designed the entire tragedy to appear like a mystery, something external, something uncontrollable, while she stood at its center, quietly orchestrating every beat. The more they uncovered, the clearer it became that Daniel's death had been inevitable from the moment he uncovered the truth. The files she tried to delete from her computer revealed that Sarah had been embezzling from the boutique for over a year, funneling money into personal offshore accounts, and paying backstreet vendors for forged documents. There were even drafts of divorce papers with Daniel A's forged signature, suggesting that if she couldn't keep him quiet, she had other options lined up to benefit from his absence. What Daniel found wasn't just betrayal, it was the collapse of the life he thought he had. Investigators believed he confronted her the night before his disappearance. Perhaps he threatened to expose her or leave. But instead of giving up control, Sarah made the choice to silence him permanently. She waited until he had fallen asleep, struck him in the back of the head with the hammer from the garden shed, and wrapped his body before sunrise. The neighbor's night vision camera hadn't caught a struggle because there hadn't been one. It had all happened silently, surgically, with chilling intent. But what disturbed police most was what came after. Sarah didn't flee, she didn't panic. She cleaned the kitchen floor, deleted messages, and removed the hammer from its usual place to make it seem like it had been stolen. She buried the evidence under the garden Daniel once cared for. She burned his clothes in the outdoor fire pit under the pretense of a ritual to clear negative energy. Then she got dressed, took a deep breath, and drove to the police station to report him missing. Every move after that, from the crying to the candlelight vigils, had been rehearsed. At her preliminary court hearing, prosecutors laid out the chilling progression of events. They revealed the audio recordings found on Daniel's USB drive and the torn pieces of his journal found in the garden burial site. The jury listened in silence as Daniel's voice echoed through the courtroom, speaking from beyond the grave about his fears and suspicions. One juror later said it was like hearing a ghost trying to solve his own murder. The defense struggled to build a case. With overwhelming forensic evidence, a known motive, and a detailed digital trail, Sarah's only remaining angle was to claim mental instability. Her lawyer suggested a psychological break brought on by financial stress, fear of abandonment, and childhood trauma. But psychologists hired by the court found no signs of delusion or dissociation. Instead, they described her behavior as consistent with narcissistic tendencies, someone who felt entitled to control every part of her life, including whether her husband lived or died. As the trial approached, the media dubbed her the widow with the flyers, referencing the grotesque irony of her public efforts to find the very man she had killed. Commentators dissected her interviews, noting the way her expressions shifted, the absence of genuine emotion, and the precise language she used, always vague, always placing emphasis on her pain rather than his loss. The public fascination grew darker by the day. Behind bars, Sarah maintained her innocence. She wrote letters to friends, insisting that the evidence was misunderstood, that she had been framed, that Daniel had enemies they hadn't investigated. But most of those friends never replied. The community had turned. The boutique was shuttered and vandalized. Her name was scratched off the town's flower festival donor wall. People who had once comforted her now crossed the street to avoid discussing what had happened. The betrayal wasn't just about the crime, it was about the false grief, the lies told face to face. Daniel's funeral was held quietly at the high school auditorium where he had taught for over a decade. Hundreds came. Former students, colleagues, neighbors all wore blue ribbons on their shirts, his favorite color. They shared memories of his kindness, his patience, and the way he always stayed behind to help those who needed it. His parents, quiet and devastated, sat in the front row with Daniel's journal clutched in his mother's hands. In a final tribute, the principal announced that a scholarship would be created in Daniel's name to support students who wanted to become teachers. As the trial date drew near, prosecutors prepared their final evidence surveillance footage. Financial records, digital forensics, voice recordings, and expert testimony from forensic analysts and psychologists. They didn't need a confession. They had something stronger, proof that told a story Sarah could no longer control. The last twist came when police found an unmailed envelope in a storage container Sarah had rented under a false name. Inside was a forged suicide note supposedly written by Daniel, expressing guilt over financial fraud and a desire to disappear. It was dated the day before his disappearance. Handwriting experts confirmed it had been copied from Daniel's old journal entries. That envelope, investigators believed, was Sarah's backup plan, her exit strategy if suspicion grew too strong. She never had time to use it. In the final weeks before trial, Sarah fired her legal team and requested new representation. Some saw it as a delay tactic, others as a sign of unraveling control. But nothing she did could change the course of what was coming. Her lies had created a puzzle she could no longer rearrange. Every action she took in the days after Daniel's murder had been documented, analyzed, and turned into evidence. What began as a mystery had become a case study in calculated deception. The woman who once stood smiling beside a missing person flyer had now been exposed as the architect of the entire tragedy. The town would never forget the name Sarah Whitmore, but not because she was a victim, because she had buried the truth with her own hands, then lit candles for the man she killed. The trial of Sarah Whitmore began under the watchful eyes of an entire nation. The courthouse steps were crowded with reporters, onlookers, and a few quiet protesters holding signs that read "Justice for Daniel." It wasn't just Maple Ridge that wanted answers anymore. This story had gripped people across the country. Everyone wanted to know how a woman who seemed so loving, so devoted, could commit a crime so cold and deliberate. But what they wanted even more was justice. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was tense. Sarah entered in a pale gray suit, her hair tied back, her face expressionless. She looked smaller than she had on television, no longer the woman crying in front of cameras with her husband's missing flyers in hand, but now a figure tightly composed and quietly guarded. She never looked at the crowd. She never looked at Daniel's family. Instead, she kept her eyes straight ahead, as if rehearsing each moment in her mind. The prosecution began with a simple statement: "This is not the story of a grieving wife. This is the story of a woman who built a lie, and when that lie was at risk, she chose murder. Over the next several days, they walked the jury through every step of Sarah's plan. They presented the financial records showing how she embezzled money and faked Daniel S.'s signature on life insurance documents. They displayed the recovered internet search history detailing how to commit and conceal a murder. They played clips from Daniel's own recordings, his soft voice describing his suspicions, his fears, and finally, his belief that Sarah was hiding something dangerous. Photos from the crime scene were shown. The garden where Daniel was first buried. The shallow creek where his body was later discovered. The hammer retrieved from under layers of soil, still stained. Each image chipped away at the illusion Sarah had worked so hard to maintain. There was no mystery anymore. There was no missing person. There was only a man who had discovered the truth and a woman who refused to let him speak it. The defense did what they could. They argued emotional distress, claiming Sarah was overwhelmed by financial pressures and acted in a moment of mental collapse. They brought in a therapist who testified that Sarah had exhibited signs of trauma linked to early abandonment issues. But under cross-examination, the therapist admitted she had never treated Sarah directly and had only reviewed secondhand notes. The jury remained unmoved. Then came the witness who silenced the entire courtroom. Daniel's co-worker, Mark, took the stand and described their last conversation. He said Daniel had told him, just days before he vanished, that he had found something on Sarah's computer. Something that proved she had been lying to him for months. Daniel didn't say exactly what it was, but he said one thing very clearly: if something happens to me, don't believe it was random. Next, investigators played audio from the wildlife camera belonging to the neighbor's son. It was distorted, but the sound of dragging and a single dull thud could be heard around 2:15 a.m., consistent with the time of Daniel S.'s broken watch and the moment Sarah was seen crossing the yard. Prosecutors showed how every piece of evidence lined up her movements: the location of the body, the altered garden, the forged documents, and finally, the storage locker containing the fake suicide note. Sarah sat motionless through it all. Occasionally she blinked rapidly or shifted in her seat, but she never showed anger, never cried, never reacted when her name was linked directly to Daniel's murder. It was as if she had detached herself entirely, a shell observing the slow collapse of the story she had spent months crafting. When the jury retired to deliberate, the town held its breath. Outside the courthouse, strangers stood in silence. News anchors speculated on live TV. Social media trended with hashtags like #JusticeForDaniel and #WhitmoreTrial. For 2 days, the jury considered the evidence. On the third morning, they returned with a verdict: guilty of first-degree murder, guilty of obstruction of justice, guilty of fraud. Daniel's parents held each other as the judge read the verdict. A few quiet sobs echoed through the courtroom. Sarah didn't flinch. She simply closed her eyes for a moment, then opened them again, as if bracing herself. When asked if she had anything to say before sentencing, she declined. There was no apology, no explanation, no final twist, just silence. The judge sentenced her to life in prison without the possibility of parole. In his statement, he said, "This was not a crime of passion. This was a crime of calculation. A deliberate effort to silence a good man and benefit from his death. You did not just take a life, you manipulated the grief of an entire community." Sarah was led away, her story ending not with forgiveness, not with redemption, but with the quiet footsteps of a convicted killer disappearing down a hallway she would never return from. Maple Ridge began to heal, but the scars remained. Daniel's old classroom was turned into a memorial study room, with a plaque that read, "In memory of Mr. Whitmore, teacher, friend, protector of truth." Students lit candles on the anniversary of his death. His parents started a foundation to help victims of domestic fraud and emotional abuse. They said their son had trusted too much, loved too deeply, and had paid the ultimate price for seeing something he wasn't meant to. People in town still whispered about Sarah from time to time. They spoke about how ordinary she seemed, how normal their lives were, and how evil can hide in plain sight, smiling as it weaves its story. The boutique never reopened. The Whitmore house remained empty, windows dark, as if the walls themselves remembered too much. Daniel's voice lived on through his recordings. They were shared online, not as evidence, but as warnings. Warnings that even the kindest people can find themselves trapped in someone else's design. His final message, the one he never meant for the world to hear, became the closing line of 1,000 retellings. If something happens to me, it wasn't an accident. In the end, the truth was buried, then dug back up. And no matter how carefully someone tries to cover their tracks, the past has a way of surfacing. Especially when the person they tried to erase made sure their voice would echo long after they were gone.